supply and what each one entails. And you're going to find that these names of these different measurements, very, very, very creative, because economists have come up with these names. So you know they're going to be creative and exciting. So the first measurement of the money supply is the M0. I told you these names are going to be exciting. So the M0 is simply the amount of physical currency that's in existence. The amount of physical currency that's in existence. So these are all of your dollar bills and coins. So you could figure out, if we were all in a classroom, one of the things I like to do is figure out what the M0 of the classroom is. So have everybody pull out any kind of dollars or change that they have, and we can count the physical currency. The M0 doesn't really have anything at all to do much with the economy. We know that we use physical currency for exchange of goods and services. We don't use it as much as we used to. Now that we have credit cards, Apple Pay, online purchases, we don't use nearly as much physical currency as we used to, but it still does get used. It's still out there. So the Federal Reserve, which we'll talk about after the quiz, they do monitor the amount of physical currency that's in existence. That's really kind of under the Treasury Department, because they're the ones that do the physical printing of physical currency. And the only reason we print new currency and then we mint new coins is to replace old worn out ones. We don't create physical currency to increase the money supply. We print up new bills because we add new counterfeiting measures. And as I'm sure you've noticed, especially if you work in a business that involves cash, dollar bills, just bills in general, get beat up over time. You get those janky, faded, thin, ripped up. There's drawings on them. So physical currency is just created to replace old, worn out physical currency. We don't care much about the M0. Doesn't do much for the economy. All right, then we have the M1. Woo, exciting names. So the M1 is the M0, so physical currency, plus any money that you have in your checking account So that's money in your checking account, not savings account. This is money in your checking account. We'll talk about what that actually means, or why it's just checking accounts. And they still count this thing that most of you have probably never seen, and some of you have probably never even heard of. Traveler's checks. Who knows what a traveler's check is?
There's like checks you'd get from the bank that represent money. So when you travel, you didn't have to carry a bunch of cash on you.
Okay, exactly. Travis, you're showing your age, man. If you know that, whew. So let's see, the last time I used traveler's checks, I think was 1989, maybe 1989. I did a trip to Europe in high school, and we had traveler's checks. When we owned a store here in Sedona, my wife, she's 8 years younger than me, we had a customer come in and pay with a traveler's check, and she had to grab me and be like, "What is this? It looks sketchy." She had never seen one in her entire life. So traveler's check, you don't need to know this, but since it's on here, I like to explain what it is. So traveler's checks, exactly what Travis had just explained. It used to be, this was in the days before credit cards were widely accepted all over the world. If you were going to go travel somewhere, you didn't want to bring $1,000 in cash with you, because if that got stolen, your money was gone. It was done. So you could go to the bank and get traveler's checks. And what traveler's checks were, they looked like you bought them in $100 increments, and it looked like a $100 bill, a cross between a $100 bill and a check. So it looked like a $100 bill, but there was a place on there to write where the money was going and for you to sign it. And each individual traveler's check had a unique serial number. So what happened would be, if your traveler's checks got stolen, you could just go to a bank and say, here's the information from the traveler's checks. They got stolen. I need new ones. So it was just a way to add security to cash. Traveler's checks are all but dead now because everybody accepts credit cards, and credit cards are just a lot easier. And they're just as secure as traveler's checks. But they are still around. They don't make up a huge part of the M1, but they are still in existence. We still do count them.
So the traveler's checks would just be like $100 or so of someone's account.
Yeah, so you can still go to the bank and buy traveler's checks. I don't know why you would, but you can still do that. And they work just like cash. If you were to take traveler's check into a store, if you bought something that was, $25 and you gave them the $100 traveler's check, they would give you $75 in cash and change.
What's the difference between that and a debit card? Is it just harder to cancel a debit card if it's stolen?
No, debit card is actually a little more secure than traveler's checks.
Okay.
And traveler's checks, you have a limited amount, whereas a debit card, you can spend whatever's in your debit card, your checking account at the time. Yeah, like I said, traveler's checks used to be extremely popular for travel, but they got replaced with credit cards, debit cards, Apple Pay, things like that. Made life a lot easier. All right, so the M1, we look at the M1 kind of as an economic indicator to judge, we're going to call immediate spending. So businesses very often will look at the M1, generally starting at around Thanksgiving, to help predict what their Christmas sales are going to be like. And if you think about it, money in physical currency or the checking account, this is money that you have that you're ready to spend immediately. So generally, businesses are going to look at the M1 and say, how much money do people currently have to spend immediately? Not that they're going to spend it immediately, but it's a good kind of short-term way to predict what, especially things like retail and consumer goods, over the next few months. So you can look at the M1. So if the M1 is way higher, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
So there's a place where you can go and look at what M1 is out there.
Yeah, and I'm gonna show you the website, and it's a website we're going to use a lot in the next couple of weeks. It's the Federal Reserve's website.
Interesting.
Yeah, just like you can go look at what the unemployment rate is, what the inflation rate, what GDP is, you can go look at the money supply, and you can look at changes in the money supply.
This is essentially a way to calculate and quantify all of people's liquid assets.
Correct. Yep. Yeah, and these are what's known as highly liquid assets. So a highly liquid asset is an asset that you're probably going to spend in the next 3 months. The term liquid asset is something that's going to be converted from cash into goods and services generally within a year. So M1 is what's known as highly liquid. You don't need to know that terminology, but since you used it in the question, we'll give you the specific terms. All right, so that's the M1. Then we have the MZM. Ooh, we're changing things around. So I'm going to put a star next to this one because the MZM is the one that we're going to be using for the rest of this semester when we talk about the money supply. So when I talk about the term money supply, we're referring to the MZM. So MZM stands for, well, let me tell you what's in, and then I'll tell you what it stands for. So the MZM is all of the M1 plus money that's in savings accounts so money that you have in the bank, but it's not tied to a checking account. It's going to be your savings account, plus this thing called money market accounts. So all savings accounts plus money market accounts. So I'm going to tell you what money markets accounts are. You don't need to know it, but again, anytime we use the term, I like to talk about what it is. So a money market account is going to be a short-term investment account for people or businesses that have a large amount of cash on hand. And generally, this is a way to get a little bit of interest on your money. Usually it is only used by businesses. And essentially the way it works is, businesses will have a lot of cash on hand. So when my wife and I, when we had our businesses here in Sedona, our bank account, the actual business bank account, generally had somewhere between $50,000 and $70,000 in it. Now, yeah, that sounds like a lot of money, and $50,000 to $70,000 is a lot of money. But in reality, to keep the 3 businesses we had running, we spent anywhere from, anywhere from, in our low months, $50,000 up to $75,000 per month to keep the businesses running. So yeah, it was a lot of money, but really it was only about 3 to 4 weeks of operating expenses. So we would keep generally $50,000 to $70,000 on hand in our bank account. Now, what we could do is we had that bank account attached to what's called a money market account. So what we would do at the end of each day, and this was done automatically, at the end of each day, the bank would take whatever cash we have and invest it in a super, super short-term investment. And by super, super short-term, I mean 12 hours. So basically from the close, about 5 o'clock when the bank closed, until 8 o'clock the next morning, that money was being invested in some other bank around the country. It's being used around the country. Now, from that, I was able to get a little bit of interest off of that money and still be able to have it there and use it every day. That's what a money market account is.
And what's the difference between that and a checking account?
So a checking account, the money's still in there all the time. You're just not getting any interest. And generally, money market accounts, banks aren't going to even offer you a money market account unless you have about $50,000 or average of $50,000. And the reason being, it doesn't make sense for them. They lose money if they're trying to manage, if you have $112 for them to set that into the money market process, it actually winds up costing them more. So that's a money market account. As I said, you don't need to understand what it means. Just understand that that's in the MZM. So the idea of the MZM, we talk about the money supply. This is the MZM. This is money that is available, all money that is available to be spent immediately. So the M1 is money that's most likely to be spent immediately. The MZM is money that is available to be spent immediately. Doesn't necessarily mean it will be. This is truly what we talk about when we talk about the money supply. That is the MZM. So this is the amount of money that is in existence. And there is one other measurement. Oh, gotta change pens. Oh boy. One other measurement that used to be, up until about a year ago, this used to be the measurement for the money supply, and they decided to change it. And that is the M2. The M2 is all of the MZM plus what's called time deposits. And again, I'll explain what time deposits are. You don't need to know what they are, but just so you understand. Time deposits are they're kind of, that's their generic term. Their specific term is CD, certificate of deposit. So if you have money in the bank, you can purchase a CD directly through your bank or certificate of deposit. And what this does is this gives the bank the use of your money for a fixed period of time, however long that CD is. And they're going to pay you interest on that money. The problem with the CD is you cannot access that money for the amount of time the CD is purchased for. So if you buy a 1-year CD, and I think you can get a 1-year CD now that gives you about 1.2% interest. So if you buy a 1-year CD and you put $1,000, so you buy $1,000 1-year CD, at the end of that year, you're going to get the $1,000 plus that 1.2% interest. But during the year, you cannot use that $1,000. That $1,000 is being used somewhere else.
Isn't
That's
that
for
really
time.
such a small interest rate? Isn't that only really good for fighting inflation?
You wouldn't even keep up with inflation with CDs anymore. CDs are good if you are really, really, really old. Not like me, really, really old, not like 46. Like if you are 96, CDs are good. Because if you're 96, you don't want to put your money at risk at all. You know, here's money you might need to move into a home soon. So you could go ahead and buy a CD, get a little bit of interest. It'll keep up with inflation, or it'll be slightly below inflation, more than just keeping it in cash, but less than inflation. And then, but that money is safe. Like I said, that money is completely safe. And if you're 96, inflation is not a big thing on your mind. You're not going to live long enough to really have inflation impact whatever money that you may have. Whereas for most of us, we still have 30, 40, 50 years to go, 60 years, 70 years. Inflation is a big deal. If you're 96, it's not that big of a deal. So the M2 used to be what we talked about, the money supply. But the problem was time deposits. We talked about the money supply. We want to know how the economy is going to be impacted. And time deposits, this is not money that can be spent immediately. By definition, it's money that cannot be spent immediately. So we stopped using the M2 and they created what's called the MZM. So the MZM is money that can be spent immediately. MZM and M2 are extremely close in amounts. There's only a couple $1 billion in existence of time deposits. These are not that big of a deal. So that's the MZM. So that's how we measure the supply of money. Any questions on how we measure it before we look at the graphs and then we talk about how we increase the MZM? Cool. So the kind of quiz question. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
How do we measure the amount of physical currency currently in circulation?
So that's going to be done by record. The Treasury Department, who operates the mints, there's six mints around the country that print physical currency, and that is all kept track of. Now, what we don't necessarily know is, I don't know, I left $20 in my apartment and there was a fire and that $20 burnt up. We don't keep track of that. But the amount of money that gets destroyed is so tiny. So the M0 right now is about $1.9 trillion. There's about $1.9 trillion of physical currency. The amount of money that gets destroyed accidentally or lost down the sewer is not going to really impact that all that much. Kind of like when you have counterfeit money thrown in there. Counterfeiting money is really, really, really difficult now. So it doesn't even impact the M0 that much. When you have 1.9 trillion, you would have to counterfeit billions of dollars just to change, 0.5%. So we don't know the exact amount. We know how much should be out there. We know how much has been created, 1.9 trillion. That's going to be off a little bit, but with most measurements, anytime you're dealing with any kind of measurements, you're never going to get an exact measurement. So we get as close as possible. All right, good questions. Any other questions?